Welcome everybody, and on behalf of myself, Emily Henderson, Anna Hopkins, and James Burford, we're delighted to welcome you to our launch of our new project report coming up. Just a couple of words to begin the session. Firstly, I just want to say thank you so much to SRHE for co-hosting this event with us. SRHE has been so supportive of my work over the last few years, and this is no exception. So this event is co-hosted between SRHE and the Doctoral Education and Academia Research Centre, or DEAR, at the University of Warwick. It's a centre that I co-direct with Jamie, and Anna is a member of our collective committee as well. And we specialise in, as the name suggests, research on doctoral education and the academic profession, often from a critical, sociological perspective. The event today is based on a new area of research that we're undertaking on research centres. As such, this is very much our first project. It's a small scale project, but hopefully also making a contribution given the kind of actual paucity of research in this area that exists already. I want to alert everyone that our report and briefings will be released online early next week. We're just waiting for them to go into the Warwick publication repository to be able to share them. So we'll send the links to these reports early next week to all attendees. We have two other events coming up for this project that focus on specific aspects of it, and we'll share details of those when we send out the slides and recording via SRHE as well. We're going to present on the project and our findings and recommendations now, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, but please feel free to put any questions you have for us in the chat as you go along. I'd now like to hand over to Anna to start off the presentation. Thanks, Anna. Are you all right for me to move slide?
Okay, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay, fantastic. So I'm just going to start by introducing the project team. Obviously, Emily, who you've already met, is the director of the DEAR Centre, and the co-investigators on the project were James Burford, who is a deputy director of DEAR, and myself. I'm Anna Hopkins, and I sit on the DEAR Centre collective representing sociology. So the outputs on the project, we had assistance on the report and also on these fabulous slides from Julie Mansui at Active for Research. And the study was funded by the Warwick Institute of Advanced Study and conducted last year in 2024. So we can go on to the next slide. Yeah, so I'm going to give you a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. First, I'll say something briefly about the rationale of the study and its design. Then I'll hand over to Emily, who is going to share some of our findings with you. And lastly, Jamie will take you through the recommendations that we outline in the report. And hopefully we'll be finished with a good amount of time for questions at the end. So Emily's already provided some background about the DEAR Centre that was founded in 2023. And this project was really driven by a desire from both Emily and Jamie to use a research-oriented approach to develop the centre and to share learning from the experiences of others too. So we focused in this project, which is called the Heart of Research, on education-related research centres in the UK, although we also hope that the findings are relevant to other disciplines and contexts. We also focused specifically on research centres with an explicit social justice related agenda. And that's really in order to consider how to embed these and other related values into both the DEAR Centre and other centres. And these aims are reflected in our research objectives, which were firstly to develop the mechanisms and mission of the DEAR Centre using a research-informed approach, and secondly, to promote a research-informed approach with an orientation towards inclusivity, equity, social justice for the development of other research centres. And it's worth saying for context, really, that literature on research centres, it's kind of a fairly small body of work and it's quite scattered across disciplines. So there is research on the nature of activity within centres and also how external interventions such as policies and funding arrangements shape centre environments. And I think there's often kind of an assumption that research centres are dynamic places that commit collaboration and facilitate specialist research, and also an idea that they're founded by ambitious individuals. But we also know that they're structured by particular working conditions. So the need to secure resources can exert different kinds of pressure on centres. They tend to be associated with overwork, with temporary contracts, which we know have unequal fallout and impacts, both for employees and for research, and that these impacts are structured by racism, sexism, colonial legacies, and many other things in knowledge production and universities. And we also know just that there's a huge variation and variety in research centres in terms of their structure, activities, and purpose. So the project also responded to a need for more research on the role of centres and how they may contribute to the enactment of values such as inclusivity, equity, or social justice in academia. So I will now go on to the study design. The project had 3 research questions, which you have up on the slide. The first is really broadly concerned with the nature of education research centres that have this focus on inclusivity, equity, or social justice. And essentially, we wanted to know, what do they do? Secondly, we wanted to look in more detail at the values, what exactly are their values and the practices of these research centres. And lastly, how were they founded? Who founded them? What did they do? And why? And in order to answer these questions, we conducted a web review of all UK universities, and we found 44 education-focused research centres with an orientation to the values that we've described. And we were really interested in this initial review in establishing the different ways in which centres are being represented online. And then we took a much deeper dive in just 5 in-depth narrative interviews. And those were interviews with the founders of research centres who we identified through the review. And the interviews asked for their stories, really, of how and why they established the centre, and also how they had established and attempted to enact its values. So with that, I think I'll pass on to Emily to talk about our findings.
Thanks so much, Anna, for introducing the study. So I'll present now 3 different finding slides relating to each research question. So firstly, just asking actually what is the nature of centres? What is it that's actually happening in centres? So something that, and this is covering across the web review and the interviews. So one aspect of what we looked at was the management structure and how governance and management was happening. So we saw that in some cases, centres were very much led by just perhaps one director. In other cases, there were management groups. And it may sound obvious in a way, but centres tended to often have meetings to engage in the sort of core business of the centre. And in a way, we're setting out some things that might seem obvious because, in a sense, they haven't already been said. So we want to set out almost just a kind of reference point of, okay, these are core activities of centres. We saw that centres usually relied on existing resources rather than having core funding. And this is an important point for the sort of sustainability of centres, that often there was a sense of scrabbling around for resources. And there tended to be limited dedicated funding and even more so limited sort of allocation of space to centres. They're normally existing in the ether, if you like, or in virtual senses or in informal gatherings, etc. They don't necessarily have an office or a place with a sign over the door. We looked at the extent to which centres were required to report on their activities. And there was quite a lot of variation across the 5 narrative interviews of what was expected in reporting from the founders in terms of having to give a detailed report to the institution or not really having any reporting requirements at all. We see such variation in how research centres are operating. Most centres did have an online presence, and this was something that was brought up again and again as sort of one of the main functions of centres to somehow show visibility both internally within an institution and externally to point to a particular kind of research work. So often the online presence took the form of a centre website, but included also YouTube channels and social media sites. We saw that centres were aiming to establish themselves as a hub of expertise, and the kinds of activities that went into that, well, included hosting events in particular. So the notion of a centre as hosting a seminar series or work in progress events or networking activities seemed to be quite a big part of what it meant to be a centre. At the same time, we also saw that centres were often discussing research funding bids and trying to provide some kind of supportive environment for those who were applying for funding. We saw that centres were often constructed both through the web review and the narrative interviews as a kind of a space, and I put space in the inverted commas because, like I said, it wasn't a physical space, but some kind of sense of a metaphorical space, an allocated existence, if you like, to share findings from existing research projects and in some way to host projects. So again, if we're talking about space in those terms of being somewhat metaphorical, also hosting is somewhat metaphorical, but in some senses, a centre is a way of locating work. In some cases, centres were publishing their own reports, sort of as we do as our Dear Centre, where we sort of list the report as published by our centre. And there were cases of centres actually hosting journals as well. And centres were engaging in policy work, particularly I think when we think about that these were education research centres, often with some kind of social justice orientation, they were often trying to bring about change in some way in policy. And centres were also partnering with relevant organisations, and there was a sense of centres not just being about sort of internal research work, but being about partnerships and engagement and impact as well. When we sort of zoom in a bit more on the kind of activities that were about actually developing almost like what we might call the future of the field, or making sure that expertise was being fostered in newer researchers, there were activities such as the work in progress events. Writing activities also came up quite a bit, and mentoring. Centres seeing themselves as a location in some sense to make sure that those who are trying to come into the field as new researchers are finding their way. Doctoral and postdoctoral provision were absolutely integral to the centres that we looked at, and that was in terms of hosting scholarships or applying for funding for doctoral students, or having doctoral affiliates, or having events specifically for doctoral students, and likewise with postdoctoral fellows as well. In some cases, centres were trying to contribute to teaching activities sort of on behalf of the centre. So we saw examples of centres actually running modules or hosting courses, but also delivering guest sessions and delivering teaching externally as well on particular kind of specialist programmes. This is obviously quite a broad brush picture of what centres do, but we do feel it's important because there's so much sense of when we talk about a research centre that everyone has their own imaginary of what that means. And we feel it's quite important to actually set out, especially for those who are new to the academy, what research centres do. And very much what I would say, standing back from this set of findings, is that although there were commonalities, the ways in which centres were engaging in these activities was extremely varied, from being, in some senses, really quite minimal and streamlined, might be a euphemistic way of talking about it, versus engaging in a huge range of of activities, depending on the kind of environment. And also from the web review, we can't always see exactly what's going on at the center. We only get the representation from the website. Okay. So now moving on to the values and the way these values were practiced. And we were really keen to try and understand from these centres who are sort of very much pitching themselves to the world as involved in inclusivity, social justice, and equity. What were they saying about themselves, and what exactly, how exactly did they translate their values and practices into being? From the web review, we saw that once again, as with the previous set of findings, that there was a huge variation in the way that the principles and values were firstly displayed on the web pages, but also expressed. What we can say is that there were lots of kind of statements about values, and these varied a lot in length and kind of the style, but many of them referred to social justice. So they were sort of using the term social justice to name that not just the research area, but the principles and values of the center. Um, we saw that not as many centres were using the language of EDI, and importantly as well, when these terms and other of the kind of social justice related terms were used, often they weren't defined in terms of what centres actually mean by having those values as a centre value. So one of our kind of findings from this is that lots of centres are using those words to categorize their work and their principles, but not necessarily really explaining what is meant by them or what it means to enact that in practice. If we move then to the findings from the narrative interviews, we had rich discussions with the 5 founders we interviewed in terms of what it meant to have these values and enact them. And I think those interviews were invaluable in understanding a bit more how centres make sense of what they believe in and what they do. So we found that centres were often, when we asked how do you enact your values, that centre founders sort of named activities as being the kind of mechanism, or if you like, of how values were enacted. So if we turn our minds back to the idea of the kind of centre governance discussed in the previous, or management discussed in the previous slide, that some of the centre leaders we talked to deliberately stated it was their practice to try to avoid hosting too many onerous meetings. And this was actually a kind of principle of thinking about the what's known as the sort of excessive workload in academia, and not wanting to make the centre yet another way of overloading academics with administrative work. So they tried to keep the meeting load light. And they also tried to keep the meetings kind of informal in tone, and not reproduce the hierarchical processes and structures of the university that they were sort of within. Centre leaders were also discussing how important kind of distributed leadership was to them as a way of enacting their kind of democratic values. So they were talking about the importance of having within the centre itself sort of types of activities that others of any career stage could lead. So particularly some of the participants dwelt on having PGR students, so doctoral students, leading on particular events, for example, and making sure that it wasn't just all sitting on the head of the centre leader. So that sort of democratic practice was part of the way that centres were expressing or enacting their values. Then when we moved to centre membership, and membership took lots of different forms within the study, and even within a centre, membership can be quite different if you're engaged in the kind of academic leadership of the centre versus being someone who maybe has a profile on the webpage and comes to some events. So there's quite different ways in which centre membership can take form. But it was clear that trying to have as inclusive as possible a membership was part of the values and agenda of these centres. And that included having ensuring that doctoral students were very much part of the centre. And it was also mentioned in one case that the centre was keen to or enthusiastic about having professional services members of staff as part of the centre, as well as having academics as part of the centre. And then as well as the kind of membership of the centre, thinking also about how the centre interacts externally and with the rest of the university and beyond. That came up quite a lot, the idea of having community consultation in some way. So when research is being developed, an agenda is being developed, actually not just going ahead with it, but actually ensuring that the centre is connected to those who are maybe have lived experience or practitioners in the specific area, and that they could feed in. So again, it's kind of an idea of inclusivity and democracy, of ensuring that it's not just a kind of elitist top-down research agenda. Then I've already discussed a few times the way that that centres tried to involve students in their activities. In one case, there was a centre where the centre leader was also an MA course convener, and she tried quite a lot to ensure that the students on the MA were invited and included in the research centre activities, but at the same time also tried to make sure that that centre work was then brought into the teaching sessions as well, in a kind of a mutual beneficial partnership. And I've already discussed doctoral student involvement quite a bit, but absolutely, I think it was sort of interesting when I was looking back through the transcripts. We shared the interviews between the three of us, and when I was looking back at how doctoral students were framed, they were often almost seen as quite an important, I think, a channel to enacting a centre's values, just to make sure that I suppose it wasn't just restricted to the academic profession, that centres really tried to work with doctoral students as a principle. Although the centre founders didn't talk that much about having challenges in enacting their values, certainly it did come up that that research centre founders were struggling in the initial years of setting up the centres to enact their values, in that firstly just struggling for available time, and Anna referred to this in the literature part as well, that centres are sort of associated with overwork often, because they don't have core funding often. The academics are sort of having to do the centre work in and around, in a way, their bread and butter work or their day jobs, and how to then not just run a centre, but run it with inclusive values, or run it in a way that's trying to contribute to social justice, then becomes quite a challenge. And I think Jamie and I can also personally testify to that challenge that we're experiencing in the Dear Centre as well. Okay, and then just the final slide. And here again, I really want to just thank our wonderful narrative interview participants when I just start presenting these findings, because I think the in just to take the time to talk us through how they set up the centres and all of the processes they went through was just a really generous contribution of time and effort. So thank you. So although we have these kind of rich narratives that we will be analysing in a more sort of narrative sense for our academic publication from this project, what I'm going to try to do here is take a kind of look across the 5 narratives and just think about how these centre founders engaged in the founding processes. So one thing that came out really strongly and was, I think, actually quite interesting to us in the Dear Centre, because we very much proposed our own centre from our own research agenda. We found that the research centres we were looking at, some of them came out of a situation of institutional reconfiguration, that there had almost been a sense of streamlining, or of changing the way that a department is set up, and that this had led to, in one case, a restructuring of a department around research centres, and another case it had led to the kind of invisibility of the particular research area. So it was like a reaction to that reconfiguration that led to the sort of founding of the the centre so that the actors involved could gain visibility for their research, even though their named department had stopped recognising their research. So sometimes it can be a bit of a almost like a activist kind of attempt to get social justice and education research recognised and renamed within the department. In other cases, it was new staff recruitment that had steered the founding of the centre. So in two cases, research active professors had been hired to two of the universities, and part of their strategy for setting themselves up in their new role was to found research centres as part of that kind of strategy. And in one case, a centre was set up because a particular funder wanted to set up a centre, and that led the founding of the centre. So the rationale for setting up centres is all sort of varied, and that has an effect in and of itself on what the centre looks like afterwards. It also came up in terms of those founders who'd already had some sort of background of research centre leadership or research centre involvement in previous roles had then led them to want to found a centre in their new role as well. And in the UK context, we have the REF, the Research Excellence Framework. It's a national research assessment framework, and that came up also as driving centres. We also found that there was a range of actors involved in founding centres. It wasn't just the founders. There were instigators of centres who were not always the founders. And in cases, this involved a range of different groupings of actors who'd come together. So there were heads of department who were involved, the kind of institutional research leaders, the senior leaders and managers of the university, funders, and other colleagues within or beyond the department. We saw roles played by all of those actors within the founding stories of these centres. So it's not just the founder who's kind of steering the ship. We saw all kinds of different hopes and ambitions for the centres that the research centre leaders were reflecting on. From creating a kind of internal structure within the university or within the department to foster a sense of belonging and support research, to actually creating a national or international reputation for the area of research and the centre providing some kind of external presence and visibility for that. The process for setting up the centres again varied widely. We saw a very kind of unbureaucratic process of almost just being able to declare oneself a centre in and amongst a context where the institutional process for setting up a centre was in flux and there was a certain uncertainty on how to actually get the thing approved. So why not just call yourself a centre? To there being quite a heavy bureaucratic process involving a lot of different actors having to approve the centre being set up. Again, the way that a bureaucratic process works then affects how the centre can frame itself and what kind of work it can do. There weren't many obstacles that the founding directors came up with in the process. There was some sense of agreeing on the centre theme, so what the title of the centre really signified and what they were trying to do with that title. I've mentioned the obstacle of the changing process for setting up centres. That was mentioned that in one case the university was itself reviewing how to set up a centre that meant it was difficult to actually go ahead and set up a centre. And there was a sort of also a kind of with the one that was funded by an external funder, there was quite a lot of negotiation between the funder and the host department on actually how to set up the centre. When we look at the impact that these centres had, we asked the founders first in terms of the impact on the kind of field and on their own career. We found that internal impact was actually seen as really important for these centres, that they'd created an important and valuable and meaningful space for them to do the kind of work they valued and find political alignment with their colleagues and to support early career researchers. There was definitely a sense of field impact and policy impact. The centre that I mentioned that was sort of commissioned by a funder had really clear impact on policy because they had regular briefings with the relevant ministry, government ministry at that time on the specific topic, and also were working through the funder had a lot of access to practitioners and people with lived experience of the issue that they were researching. So there was a quite wide-ranging impact, particularly for that centre. But in all of the five centres, they certainly were making a contribution to the research area. When we looked in on the impact on the actual individual centre founders' careers, they'd received certain, in some cases, professional recognition. In one case, the centre leader was given a sort of national accolade for her work on the centre. And had also achieved a 4-star ref case study for those of you who know and care what that means. At the same time, there was also some negative impact, such as stress and overwork of colleagues. And you can see a couple of excerpts on the right-hand side there. In one case, Kit says the research centre, and these are pseudonyms, I should say, the research centre allowed me to feel supported and give support. And she talked a lot about a kind of feminist ethic of co-working and collective working within her centre. And in Leah's case, it's quite a almost like opposite sentiment where she said it's the development of my academic career that led to the setting up of the centre more than the centre adding to my career. And in a couple of cases, the centre founders really felt that they hadn't been really recognised for the centre work in and of itself, that they'd maybe done a lot of work and it just hadn't been noticed. In one case, the centre was winding down at the time of research, and it was only at that point that lots of people were coming out and saying, "Oh, that's such a shame. You do such great work." So it wasn't always celebrated and easy either. I'd now like to round off the findings. I think you can see that there's, even within five centres, a huge array of different accounts and rich accounts of how these centres were founded and working. And from these findings, even though it's a small sample, because of the kind of paucity of research in this area, we've tried to develop what we see as quite important recommendations for institutions who are hosting research centres and for research centre leaders. I'd like to hand over to Jamie now to present these recommendations. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Emily. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So, yes, as Emily said, I'm now going to take us through the recommendations from the project. And these have been developed both from recommendations that were directly suggested by the participants during the final part of the interviews we conducted with them. But we've also derived these recommendations from the web review and from a wider analysis of the interviews that we led. So that's where these recommendations are coming from. So these recommendations are arranged into three broad stakeholder groups. And the first set, as you can see here, are recommendations for institutions hosting research centres to promote inclusivity. So the first recommendation is that institutions should ensure that there is clarity in processes for setting up research centres. And that guidance and questions about how a centre will create an inclusive research culture are included in the official paperwork. We also have an additional recommendation that institutions provide clear guidance on accountability and reporting mechanisms for research centres and embed reporting inclusivity within the official process. So this would include guidance on expectations for research centres that also allow for a lead in time while centres become established. A further recommendation is to offer developmental, informative opportunities for research centre leaders to develop their practice, in addition to retrospective accountability and reporting processes. So ensuring there are inputs available to those research centre leaders to help them develop. A further recommendation is to develop core funding schemes and formalise workload allocations for research centres. So these could be in tandem with reporting and accountability, but without institutional support for research centres, what we saw across the project was an emphasis on, firstly, centre leaders overwork, and also secondly, the use of short-term and precarious contracts for support staff. A further recommendation is to offer training and development opportunities for researchers who are considering setting up a centre or already leading a centre. These opportunities could include embedding inclusivity, equity, social justice principles into centre work, and they could of course be offered as part of wider institutional development opportunities for research active staff, or equally as part of a forum for research centre leaders. So there are many ways that this kind of development could be offered. A final recommendation here for institutions is to consider how research centres can contribute to institutional research strategy and institutional social inclusion, or EDI strategy, and encourage this work and to celebrate success. So those are the recommendations we have for institutions. The next set of recommendations are for centre leaders to think of ways to embed inclusivity in their centres. So we first recommend that centre leaders include definitions and aims and objectives and principles relating to inclusivity, equity, and social justice in research centre proposals and reporting. Even if this isn't an explicit expectation from the institution, it is a valuable thing for research centres to do. We also recommend that leaders suggest improvements to official paperwork in terms of engaging more explicitly with issues of inclusivity, equity, and social justice in research centres, and request training and development for research centre leaders in relation to the processes of setting up centres and embedding inclusivity, equity, and social justice as part of wider institutional development opportunities for research active staff. That is a recommendation there. We also have recommendations for research centre leaders within their centre practice. So a first recommendation here is something that happens at the beginning or founding of a centre to co-define through active workshop processes the focus and direction of the centre with the core membership, including in relation to values pertaining to inclusivity, equity, and social justice. This is, of course, something that can happen not only at the beginning, but also through a periodic review process as well. A second recommendation within a centre practice is to develop and then periodically review centre management plans and strategy, including core aims and activities, and how the centre will enact practices pertaining to inclusivity, equity, and social justice. So as I said before, if institutional paperwork is insufficient, centre leaders can develop their own centre style of strategic planning and reporting, and consider some of those concerns that Emily raised in the findings around overwork, use of precarious contracts, how centre governance will function in a democratic and inclusive manner, and how values and principles such as inclusivity, equity, and social justice can be embedded in different areas of centre governance and activity. So we've got some further recommendations for centre leaders to produce a communication strategy that reflects the values of the centre, to map the centre's various activities and reflect on how to embed principles of inclusivity, equity, and social justice into these activities. So, for example, through events, through projects, through visiting researchers, each of these have opportunities to embed these kinds of values. And then a further recommendation to consider how the centre will curate the future of the field through developmental and inclusive hosting of doctoral students and postdoctoral fellows, as well as providing opportunities for undergraduate and master's students to engage with the centre work via activities and contributions to the teaching offer. The third set of recommendations are beyond centre practices. And here we recommend that centre leaders develop an engagement strategy for the centre that includes meaningful engagement with relevant groups and stakeholders in setting the research agenda, as well as disseminating findings, and that they also consider how centres can contribute to relevant communities of practice, for example, through accepting invitations to give talks in community settings or contributing to policy consultations and other things like that. Thanks, Emily. The final set of recommendations are recommendations for further research on research centres. We recommend that future researchers engage in comprehensive literature reviewing. This is required to understand existing knowledge about research centres across disparate fields. We know that the literature here is scattered across different disciplines, and so comprehensive work on this would be very valuable. A second recommendation is that more research is needed on research centres across disciplines, including how centres sit within and alongside traditional institutional structures, how they're governed, managed, funded, and which factors contribute to centres fulfilling their missions, for example, of innovative, interdisciplinary, or international research. A further recommendation for future researchers is to conduct research on how research centres both perpetuate and challenge inequalities. That theme was certainly clear through this project, and there's a trace of that in the previous scholarship in this area. And so we need to be looking at both of these roles that research centres can play. A further recommendation is to call for more research to compare research centres across national contexts. This study has begun looking at research centres in the UK, but we really think that comparative research would be very valuable. And further research is also required on how research centres use a wide range. Further research is required using a wide range of research methods. So it would be great to see further innovative and creative approaches used to conduct research on research centres. And as you've seen, hopefully through our talk today so far, that the role of the research centre founder or leader is really crucial, and we think it is worthy of further exploration, and we hope that we've begun a platform for further research to be conducted in this space. Thanks, Emily. So as you can see here, we have a range of project outputs that are making their way out into the world next week. We have a project report which will be released, which goes into detail into the findings and recommendations that we have shared today in some depth. And so we do encourage you to have a look at that. We also have two different briefing documents that we have produced. So one is a briefing for research centre directors. So if you have any research centre directors in your life, please send this on to them. We also have a briefing for higher education institutions, and that will be particularly useful for colleagues in leadership roles within institutions to understand the kinds of settings that help research centres thrive. So yes, please do look out for those outputs that will be coming out next week. So that concludes our presentation today. Thank you all so much for coming.